Hi everyone, welcome to Miss Adams Teaches Poetry. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at Dylan Thomas's very famous poem, Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night. This poem is incredibly powerful and is a series of almost instructions, very kind of passionate, almost aggressive instructions to not take death lightly, to fight against it. Now, Dylan Thomas was a Welsh poet around from 1914 to 1953. Maybe ironically or perhaps just quite poignantly, he wrote this poem in 1951, so just 2 years before he died, I believe from alcohol poisoning, in fact. Now, if you think about the fact that this poem was written in 1951, it means that he's just lived through the Second World War. So some people feel that this poem about saying no to death and fighting against death is because of what happened during the war. And I think there's definitely elements of the poem that sit within that. I think there's also a more personal feel to the poem that is perhaps aimed towards his father as well, as there are some references to blindness. And then at the very end, he does actually directly speak to his father in that final stanza. It's an absolutely stunning poem. So powerful, so emotional. So let's get started. Okay, let's start by having a little look at this opening. So the first thing to be aware of is this direct address with the imperative. Do not go gentle into that good night. And that begins a refrain that is going to be repeated, or one of two refrains that's going to be repeated throughout the poem. So it really gives us the main message. It's an instruction to fight back against death. Good night is a euphemism for death, and euphemisms for death are used the whole way through, perhaps because he's saying that death, the narrator is saying that death is something that is difficult, hence needing to fight against it. He says that old age should burn and rave at close of day. So we've got this personified old age, but it's quite metaphorical, the idea of burning and raving. But there's a kind of like mania in this. It's fighting back, it's conflict. There's quite an interesting juxtaposition between the emotive verbs burn and rave with this then quite softened euphemistic way of describing death, the close of day, a metaphor in itself. And I quite like the use of it. It's not just the main verbs here, but it's the modal verb should, suggesting that it's the sort of like duty or obligation to kind of fight against death. And then we have the final line of the first stanza, which makes up the second repeated refrain of the poem. Rage against the dying of the light. So another bit of direct address, another imperative. And in this case, rage is a verb, and the repetition of that very emotive verb, rage again, encapsulates this need to push back against death. And again, another euphemistic metaphor to describe death, the dying of the light, light being an image of life. Second stanza. Though wise men at their end know dark is right. So wise men, I think we're going to take from that adjective that he's talking about philosophers. And there's a sort of sense of acceptance being created here, in that they know that dark is right. So they understand that at some point they have to die. But what holds them back is because their words had forked no lightning. Now this metaphor is quite cool because the lightning is a metaphor for knowledge. And so what he's saying is philosophers who haven't found the answers, who haven't quite found the wisdom that they were seeking, perhaps about life itself, are going to rage. They're going to not go gentle into that good night, almost like they're disappointed that they haven't found the answer, they haven't found the key. And then, like I said before, we've got this refrain, do not go gentle into that good night. So you'll notice here that this has been made a refrain because it's a repetition of the first line of the stanza. Okay, we'll talk about form at the end. Okay, next two stanzas. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Now, this is interesting. I think the impact of the adjective good men, so men who are morally sound, who should be respected. So it makes me think that he is potentially referring to soldiers here. And then we've got this metaphor for death here, the last wave by, a kind of sea metaphor. But they're going to, in that last wave, in that last surge of life, they're going to be crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced. Note this juxtaposition between the notion of sorrow and frailty and then brightness and dancing. It's all about kind of missed opportunities. And it's obviously personified as well, like the idea that their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. That modal verb might again suggest that perhaps their deeds haven't. And the fact that the deeds are referred to as frail, this adjective, it sort of suggests again maybe like a loss of hope or a loss of meaning or a loss of impact. Men who went to war to fight, actually their deeds are frail, they're vulnerable, they're not really as sort of brave and strong as perhaps everyone thinks. And so he's saying those people there should rage against the dying of the light. There's a kind of sense of life in the colours that are being used, this metaphorical image of dancing in a green bay. Green is a colour of life and hope. It's moved on to mean envy, but I don't think it's being used in that way. I think it's more the kind of pastoral traditions where green signified hope and new life. So this stanza seems to be about expectation and disappointment. And so those should rage against the dying of the light. Note the third line of the first stanza is being repeated here as the refrain. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight. Now this is interesting. Wild men, so this adjective here, wild, makes me think that these are men that took life with both hands, caught and sang the sun in flight, or tried to get as much out of life. But I also think there's something quite dangerous in this imagery. I think perhaps Dylan Thomas was referring to Icarus, who you may remember from mythology, had wings made, but then he went too close to the sun, his wings melted, and then he fell to his death. So I think there's this idea of men who enjoy, but actually don't make enough of it, and then they learn too late. They grieved it on its way. So there's this idea about understanding mortality and that, life is short, and this kind of notion of regret. And those people, again, he says, do not go gentle into that good night. I'm not going to write repeated refrain every time it comes up. Now, this adjective, grave men, so notice how each of the stanzas is starting with a type of man. I think we could argue that this is a homonymic pun. It could mean grave as in people who are serious. That's what grave can mean. But it could also be men going to their graves, so men on the point of death. Think Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. Ask for me tomorrow, you will find me a grave man. It's the same pun. Grave men near death who see with blinding sight. Now this is an interesting oxymoron. So who see with sight, whose vision actually blinds them. So this is about illumination, knowledge and understanding, and how powerful it is. And then he continues this image. He says, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Gay here meaning, of course, happy. So there's a real kind of juxtaposition here between this idea of happiness and graveness, grave men near death. I think this notion about blind eyes that could blaze like meteors, again, it's this idea of potential and what's behind. Now, interesting, especially with where the next stanza is going. His father was blind. So there is this notion here that he's starting to actually talk more personally, and he's thinking about his father who, despite being blind, his eyes blaze like meteors, with such passion and such power. That's what I get from that simile. And then the final stanza, which you'll see is now 4 lines long. Now it's a quatrain. And you, my father. So we've got this direct address, but now it's specifically to the individual. My father, there on the sad height. That's a metaphor for old age. So up high, you know, because he's lived for that long, but it's a sad height. Slightly personified as well. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears. A bit of an oxymoron or a paradoxical image. He's saying that the fierce tears, personified tears there. So again, an image of like passion and power would be both a curse and a blessing, you know. So obviously he doesn't want to see his father crying. It could be seen as a curse, especially the fierceness of it. But also it would be a blessing because it would mean he would be here and he would be alive and he would be staying. Curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Now I think that little verb there, I pray, it really encapsulates everything. It's that desperation, and then you get the final refrain, both lines. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage against the dying of the light. So that final little rhyming couplet there, so powerful. And you'll notice that the 2 lines, when they're next to each other, fully follow on. You know, it's 2 instructions. Don't go gentle into that good night. Instead, rage, as in fight against it. This is a call for him to live. And although it has been general about all men, now it's so personal because it's about his father. So yeah, a very powerful ending. Now, a couple of notes on form. This might be new vocabulary for you because this is a French type of poem called a Villanelle, and it is a very tightly structured poem. Villanelles have 19 lines made up of 5 3-line stanzas and then 1 4-line stanza. The rhyme scheme is fixed. So the 5 stanzas, the tercets, are A, B, A. And then the final quatrain is A, B, A, A. And the rhyme is made because obviously the two A's of all of the other stanzas are being put together at the end. Okay, so basically you get those 2 lines turned into refrains, repeated alternately in each stanza until that final stanza when they're both put in. So it's a very, very kind of clearly structured form. And I wonder if his choice in using this is a kind of irony that, you know, this is a poem which is about fighting against the expectation and fighting against the inevitable, yet the poem is incredibly structured. You could also argue that it's this idea of the cyclical nature of life, the fact that we keep coming back to the same ideas, or it keeps coming back to the same argument about fighting against that natural cycle, with the poem being cyclical in itself. 2 ideas for you to talk about with form. I hope that was useful. It was a little bit of a flyby, so if there's anything I haven't covered and you want more clarity, or you've got any questions or alternative interpretations, please pop them in the comments and I will be very happy to get back to you. Otherwise, that's it from me. Thank you so much for watching and happy revising.